Good evening, everybody. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm the Director of the Center for Global Studies, and I have the pleasure of guiding you through today's session on climate change, water, and governance, jointly organized by the Center for Global Studies and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. Before we get going, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the universities stand, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship to this land continues to this day. And you will see how the wisdom of those who have lived in this territory for tens and thousands of years will maybe provide one of the keys to the questions that we will tackle tonight. And when we design an event on climate change, we face one central challenge, and this will be one of the guiding themes of this evening, is how do we react to the scope, the enormity, and also the urgency of the problems posed by climate change. How do we translate our increasing knowledge about the risks and potentially dramatic effects on the ground into actions that are at the level and the scope of the problems that we are faced with? And this is, you can speak, many people feel almost overwhelmed or almost paralyzed by the very idea of how do we do this. And so very deliberately, we put opportunities into the subtitle of today's session to allude you to and to shed light on particular ways of addressing this global phenomenon, also at different levels of governments, also in our local communities. And trying to understand how we could translate something that is by its very nature global and partly being addressed at the UN level with the Sustainable Development guidelines and goals. How do we translate this into our practices? How do we change our lives' practices? How do we design effective policy solutions that would do this in an effective manner? And to bring things even closer to home, we thought our focus for tonight could be and should be on one of the essentials of life, which is water. And as I introduce this session, you see Jody, my collaborator from the Center for Global Studies, filling the jugs for us to drink and to be replenished during our proceedings. And do you see this jug over there? This is about 18.9 liters. This will be the amount of water, roughly, that each citizen of Cape Town will have to deal with after the public water distribution system will be shut down. At the moment, they schedule this for July 4th, when indeed the water supply for this multi-million inhabitant city will run out. This is one of the more dramatic effects, and you can link this to climate change, that might become far more regular an appearance than we have today. And this amount of water will basically have to do for each person to drink, to cook, to wash, everything related to water. It gives you a very dramatic idea about the limitations that we reach. And so one way of addressing issues of climate change tonight will be through looking at its impact on the hydrological system and on water governance, both at the global level but also at the local level. I'm very pleased that jointly with PICS, the Center could put on a very distinguished panel that will allow us, and this is very much the mandate of our research centers here on campus, to look at the issue of the global climate change from a multidisciplinary perspective. And you will see in a second, we do this through the lenses of the social sciences, the humanities, the sciences themselves, trying to tackle three connected questions. One would be to look at potential technological solutions and approaches to tackle the challenge of climate change, in particular now with our focus, the governance of water. The second one will be the wider transformation of our basic narrative and understanding, and also way of approaching climate change in our daily lives. I think we're aware of how fundamental the transformation it is that we need to implement to address the long-term effects of climate change. And last but not least is what kind of modes of governments, what forms of collective behavior and policy do we need to do this in an effective and sustainable fashion. And how we designed the panel is to start in a way to set this up in a global context and gradually move closer to our local context and what we could do in a very concrete fashion in our communities. And I thought I don't introduce the panel all at once, but do it speaker by speaker so it's easier for you to remember and be acquainted with our speakers. I would like to start off with Ged McLean. You see his names? Yeah, here. The second speaker to my left. Ged McLean is the Associate Director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions here on campus, and he has spent 13 years as a professor of mechanical engineering at UVic. Dr. McLean holds a BSc, MSc, and PhD degrees in systems design engineering from the University of Water, very appropriate for tonight, and he is formerly the science advisor for the Institute of Breakthrough and Energy Technologies, and both the director and the director of strategic planning for the Institute of Integrated Energy Systems, ISWIC, here on campus, another research center. In 2002, he founded Angstrom Power Incorporated, later owned by BIC Incorporated, where he developed state-of-art fuel cell systems. And finally, Mr. McLean has been a lead inventor in more than 8 patents with research contributions in areas including design methods, energy systems, art databases, embedded systems, and image processing. So, Ged, the floor is all yours, and I start you off with one question into your presentation, which is looking at what we've been facing, over the past couple of years. Wildfires, floods, extreme weather events have plagued our globe not only this year, the past couple of years. Is this the new normal? Is this what we will have to face as a systemic impact of global change, climate change?
Thank you. So the answer is yes. Thank you very much.
So you can sit down again?
Just I'd like to correct 1 or 2 points in my bio. I went to the University of Waterloo, and perhaps Dr. Schmidtke is making a bit of a pun there, given the title, that both the loo and the water sort of fit in. Or perhaps more to the point, that's what he thinks of my alma mater. I don't know. I'm proud of my alma mater. So what happens when you ask an inventor, an engineer, a washed-out entrepreneur to talk about climate science? Well, this is what happens. I figured I'd start by just talking about the royal family for a couple of minutes and then kind of work out the clock. So why would I be showing you a picture of the royal family? I'd just like to offer this to begin with a touch point to our lived experience. We all can relate to the royal family. They're a family we've all grown up with here in Canada. Many of you will relate. I relate because I live in a family that has 4 living generations. And unfortunately, I'm closer to Prince Charles than the younger people. And within that lived experience, the warmest years of Prince, when she was a princess, but now Queen Elizabeth's youth, are actually a lot colder than the coldest years of the young Prince George. And that actually is a profound thing, for this to have happened in one lived experience of people who are all alive today and all relating with each other. And I'd just like to begin there, and I'd like you to reflect on this notion that what you're experiencing, your experience of not weather, not particular summers, but your experience of climate, of averages over your lifetime, might be profoundly different from the experience that not necessarily your children, because there's big overlap there, but certainly your grandchildren will experience. And I think this is actually something that we need to take home and think about really hard. Also, scientists are loving this new term. I hear it ever since I returned to the university 2 years ago, the Anthropocene. Okay, we're entering a new era in which it's acknowledged that humans have permanently affected the world around us. And although this debate, it's kind of like 1950. The first nuclear bomb is sort of seen as the beginning of the Anthropocene, as is this rapid change in temperature due to CO2 emissions, which is climate change. And while I've just looked backwards for a second and talked about it, I'm now going to go to the graphs. So unfortunately, now you're going to be stuck with data and graphs for the rest of the talk. I am an engineer. What can I do? So the historical record is there, and I'm just going to, if I can, use this so that I can keep it close to my mouth. And looking forward, you'll see this graph 6 times tonight. I've seen all the slides. I think you'll see it 6 times in one form or another. We have a choice about the future. We have a choice about whether there is even the possibility of a new normal, and that comes by following the blue line, which is achieved through some pretty major change in our behavior. My point tonight is going to be that the new normal is change. On the other hand, if we don't change our behavior, we maintain the status quo, there is no hope of a new normal on this world. It is going to be change after change after change, and we suspect overall getting worse. You'll see that a lot, so we can come back to that. And you think, okay, that's global averages. But what about British Columbia? Well, it may be interesting for you to know that in British Columbia, over the last 100 years, we have measured roughly in Victoria a 1 degree Celsius temperature increase over the last 100 years. And in northern British Columbia, almost a 2 degree Celsius increase. This is not a projection. This is not a statement about modelers have. This is a statement about historians have. This is a statement about the summer of your parents' or your grandparents' youth versus our experience today. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the organization that internationally looks at the global picture, states in one of their assessment reports quite recently what we would expect through climate change, through emissions, largely of carbon dioxide and other gases, into the atmosphere that's changing the ability of the atmosphere to retain heat. Warmer surface temperatures, check. Significant changes in precipitation patterns and drier summers, check. I don't know. Increased extreme weather events. And the list goes on, right? There are some positive benefits. Maybe Alberta will be able to grow grapes and then they can have lots of wine. Some negative effects, just talking about land use issues and First Nations. Traditional cultural practices may no longer be possible, causing massive cultural change, right? Not necessarily measured by economics of the first world or on a global scale by the UN or by GDP, but massive change to the families that count. So let's talk about forest fires, because in 2017, there's no question, British Columbia saw the biggest forest fire burned ever. Right-hand side, look at that big blue graph, right? Massive amount of land area burned. We're all hypersensitive. I am, right? Because I get paid to be trying to find climate change solutions. And oh no, what's going on, right? The fire, the land is burning because of climate change? Well, yeah, just hold on. From a scientific point of view, attributing events to climate change is really tough. Specific events to climate change is really tough. And I just want to talk about that in the context of forest fires. I've just pulled together some statistics that look at the area burned by forest fires over the last 10 years. Does that? Yeah, if we could dim the lights so you can see that better, that'd be great. I'll pause for a second. You can pretend that I'm singing to you. I'm sure there's a way to do this from my iPhone. Well, I'm just going to have to keep on going. I'm sorry. Okay. If you're really interested in the specific numbers, I can provide those to you. I just wanted you to see the relative size of burns. if we were to show temperature trends like I did at the beginning, you see a trend and you instantly visually say to yourself, oh yeah, there's a trend and this is what we're talking about. When you look at the forest fire data, there's no real trends, right? Like 2015, that we all remember, is a really bad forest fire year. It wasn't so much that it was bad, it was where the forest burned that was bad. It wasn't the amount of forest that burned that was particularly noteworthy. If we look at the biggest forest fires in our 60, 70 year looking back, no question 2017 is the biggest, but the next one is 1958. That's the year before I was born. Still within living memory, but a long time ago. 2016 doesn't make the list. 2014 is kind of like fourth down there. It's difficult to make the trend, and I would say this is actually the leading edge of scientific inquiry right now, is how do you downscale the models that are global models of what climate will do, and downscale them to a regional model so that you can predict, and ultimately so that you can attribute, because this will become important, this attribution issue will become important. I'd say this is a cautionary tale. Now, am I saying that forest fires aren't being caused by climate change? Well, I'm saying that particular years can't be attributed and particular forest fires can't be attributed, but if we look at projections of the conditions across our country that would generate forest fires, I don't think anybody is going to argue that the conditions for forest fires are certainly more amenable to them, significantly so, and therefore, based on what we know about the changing climate, we would expect more forest fires. But attributing a particular forest fire, not so much. This is Natural Resources Canada data that was published last year in July, coincidentally with this massive fire season that we saw. All I want you to do is look at the colors. Darker colors indicate a growth in the length of what they call the wildfire season. Wildfire season has about 5 criteria to define the length of the wildfire season. The most important one is frost-free days. But it's all altitude-driven and stuff, so it's a bit more complicated than that, but frost-free days. If we take that blue line path on that graph that I showed you at the beginning, and are very conservative, and we conserve, and we stop to the extent that we can, emitting, and therefore slow down climate change, we see that we can expect in most parts of British Columbia and Alberta by 2100 an increase in the length of the forest fire season somewhere around a month. Okay? So yeah, we would expect that the probability of fires increases because you've got a longer season, and in the middle of the season, it's hotter. If we don't do anything, you get to the bottom right, and it suggests that if we don't change our behavior and we continue business as normal, by the end of the century, we're going to increase our forest fire season by at least 3 months, which in places in Canada, the bottom left is sort of like how long it is now. It ends up as longer than a year. So basically, the whole year is forest fire season. In places where now it's maybe 4 or 5 months, 6 months, that type of thing. Forest fires are coming. A particular forest fire, who knows? So, last sort of points. Are forest fires therefore a natural occurrence, or forest fires going forward, are they human-caused climate change emission? Big question. I'm not so sure. I'm sure worried about it, because the emissions from forest fires in British Columbia last year were almost 3 times the emissions from all human activity. So they weren't caused by humans, right? We've established that. But if this goes on year after year, I think I know what we need to do to help climate change. We need to fix the forest fire problem. But you know what? You can't do that. What you got to do is stop the emissions, because that's what we can control. So let's talk about water a little bit and think about our water resources. We are talking about water tonight. And here it's a little bit clearer that you can attribute what's going on in our province to climate change. The models would predict that we would have wetter springs and drier summers, which is kind of odd. And in 2015, we saw near record highs and record lows in our water flows. We saw soil moisture all-time low and evaporation all-time high. And I don't have the data for you because it's not prepared, but 2016 and 2017, same trends. We're seeing trends now. Can you see dots up there? Okay, that's all you need to see. I understand the lighting is not great. Those dots should all be little clear circles to say this is normal. On the left, what they're doing is they're measuring it. Every dot is a measurement of river flow in the province, every dot. And it's color-coded. And when you see a blue dot, I'm seeing blue, I hope you're seeing blue, that is actually saying that you're within 90 to 100% of the all-time high that you've ever seen. Same place, this is March, April, May. Skip June, I don't know why. June, July, August, September, same places. And can anybody distinguish dots from square, little diamonds up there? Okay, well, there's a bunch of diamonds up there. And the diamonds indicate record low. The red diamonds mean record low. 50% of those dots are actually red diamonds. Same place, you go through, record flow in the spring, minimum flow in the summer. Drought and flood, same place. Complete change in how our hydrological cycle works. All the black stuff is the accumulated historical averages for this one location, Thompson River at Spencer's Bridge. That's one of those dots. And what we're seeing is 2015 is the blue line. And 2015 is the new normal for flow in the province. This does not sort of, now you'll hear lots of questions about snowpack and things like that, but higher in the winter, much higher flows in the winter. The peak flow is a lot lower, comes earlier. And later on in the summer, lower and lower flows. Massive change. And what's going to happen to things like how we use our land in the province in the site of that? Possibly more water in the province, but you can't hang on to it. That's the challenge, right? And then less water when you really want it. Question for me, being more of an energy systems person, interested in small-scale hydroelectric is, what looks good today as a small-scale potential might not be there, particularly when, I don't have the graph anymore, but peak demand tends to be when the flow is minimum, right? And what's the cost of dealing with all this and how are we going to do it? Yeah, okay, yeah. He's on me. Here's that graph again. This is told in a different way. This is showing our emissions, the black line, emissions still going up. For 3 years, we thought emissions were stabilized globally. Last year, they said, oops. Once we factor in El Nino and a few other things, yeah, we didn't emit as much, but that doesn't mean that we got any better. We're back on a positive emissions trend. The path we're on is sort of up to the right. The path we need to be on is down low. So what have we got to do to get on this path that will get to less than a 2-degree change? Because we think that's where things can stabilize and we can actually have a normal. And I just would like to point out where the zero emission line is. And you notice how all those graphs that take us down into the 2 degrees Celsius range go below zero emissions? This is a new normal that I would wager 50% of you have never really had to think about before. We are going to globally have to take some carbon out of the atmosphere. That's going to be fun. So all these people in red jackets, okay, they are working on something called nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is the holy grail of power generation. It's not feasible today, but on the other hand, you know, if it were, it would be great. Lots of power, no side effects, no emissions, and the nuclear waste doesn't exist for fusion. There's no such thing. You're bringing things together, not splitting things apart, right? It's the opposite of fission. These guys, by the way, all work in Vancouver. And the solutions to climate change, technical solutions, are coming through companies like General Fusion that are out there privately funded and just going for it. About 100 people, a lot of engineers, a lot of scientists from our local universities. It's a local company trying to do state-of-the-art, world-changing work. So we've got to decarbonize energy. We've got to rethink how our energy system works. I think some of the most fascinating work on the demand side is going on at the municipal level. You see a lot of calls for 100% renewable energy, policies that are implementing no carbon, that are coming from the grassroots. It's just terrific. Ted is going to talk more about negative emissions. I just wanted to point out another great Canadian technology. This is in Squamish. And what are all these fans doing? They are sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's one of perhaps 3 installations in the world that's actually doing this. Canadian technology, homegrown, a lot of UVic grads involved, building the future from a technical point of view. And I recognize there are other points of view besides the technology. The third thing we have to do is we have to deal with the problems we've created. Climate change, unfortunately, is not just a projection. And unfortunately, in the news, we hear scientists project that by 2100, it's going to be horrible. And I don't think it will be, by the way. But what I do know is that 2018 is suffering the effects of climate change. We talked about forest fires. We talked about water, right? This is Vancouver. I know there's a few people here from Vancouver. This could be your street. So what's the problem here? The problem is that the sewers can't keep up with the rainfall. That's a climate change issue, folks. It's not bad civil engineering. It's civil engineering for the pre-Anthropocene, if you really want to dress it up. But it's basically old thinking about the effects of climate change. So we need to know a lot more to monitor. This is like job security for scientists. We've got to monitor, observe and study. But we really need more and more data so that we can properly design for the future. And the designing for the future is strategies that are robust, not fragile. We don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know where we're going to stop. So we can't just say, well, let's design for a 4-foot snow load on the roof. It might be 6 feet. But if you design for 10 feet, then you're spending too much money. So this is the challenge for the future. Is it's got to be robust so that we can handle a variety of conditions. And finally, we all have to start to take this a lot more personally. It's about our families. It's about our lived experience. It's not about the experience generations down the road. It's here. It's arrived, and we need to deal with it. Last slide, Oliver. Climate will continue to change. The new normal is, unfortunately, change. We, to a certain extent, do have some choice. We've got to do 3 things. Technically, we've got to mitigate, we've got to implement negative emissions, and we've got to adapt. Less technically, we've got to stop making it worse. We've got to clean the place up, and we've got to deal with the mess we made. That is the new normal.
Quick question that probably is on everybody's mind. How quickly will it get worse? You know, according to some of the phenomena, flooding, wildfires, and so forth. How close we are to facing the more dramatic effects?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm in the same boat as everybody else. We have lots of models and things like that, but actually predicting specific local change is very much the state of the art, and you'd need somebody else. But what I would like to say is that the time element is important, in that if we start to look at how long it takes for innovation to happen, and you start to look at the time that we know we have, they don't line up very well. Innovations take 50, 60 years to really get rolled out. We don't have 50 or 60 years, so that's more of a concern for me.
Now let me introduce our second speaker, Ted Parsons, who is currently in residence at the Center for Global Studies while on sabbatical from UCLA for the academic year. Ted Parsons is the Dan and Ray Emmet Professor of Environmental Law and Director of the Emmet Institute on Climate and the Environment at UCLA, and clearly more technologically gifted than we are here. His research focuses on international environmental law and policy, the role of science and technology in policy making and political economy of regulations. And Dr. Parsons has led several multi-advisory committees for groups, including the National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, as well as other national and international bodies. And in addition, he has been advisor on and had held academic positions and consulted with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Technology Assessment of the U.S. Congress, the Privy Council Office of the Government of Canada, and so forth. And Ted, in a way, represents the multidisciplinary nature of the approach we want to take, because he holds degrees in physics from U of T, management science from UBC, and a PhD in public policy from Harvard. So I'm done with your introduction. Are you done with the technology? Or?
I didn't think I was coming to do a comedy act.
Okay, to the more serious stuff. Here you go.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks to you all for being here. Right. Okay. Regional climate, regional resources, and the management and adaptation challenges that relate to regional resources that Ged was talking about all sit within an envelope of the global. And my job is to talk a little bit more about global trends, global responses, and what they mean, to bring it back for the more regionally focused speakers who follow me. So I'm going to start by picking up the picture that Ged showed, and I'm just going to hammer home, or try to hammer home a little more, just how bad, how sobering it is. Okay, 1950, 2000, here we are about here, roughly 1 degree centigrade warmer than pre-industrial temperatures. Since the 1990s, since people first started paying attention to global change, global climate change, emissions have roughly tracked the top of the projections of future trends. So at least between 1990 and now, we've sort of been on the top of the envelope. Now, if we stay on that path, then we pass 2 degrees C around 20. Technology is haunting me, it is cursing me. We passed 2 degrees around 2040, and by the end of this century, we're headed to 4 or 5. The gray shadows that you might not be able to see are uncertainty bound. So if somebody tells you, oh, there's tons of uncertainty about climate change models and projections, yes, there's tons of uncertainty. And the uncertainty extends roughly from really bad to really, 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 really bad. So the existence of uncertainty doesn't provide warrant for inaction. Now, there's one piece of recent good news and there's one piece of recent bad news in this. The good news is recent analyses have suggested it's going to be really hard to stay on this top red track. So probably it won't be as bad as the red track maps out. It's going to be really hard basically because we run out of cheap fossil fuels relative to all the attractive alternatives, and so even if we continue to do essentially nothing, we probably fall off that track. The bad news is that it also looks really, really hard to get much below the yellow track in the middle here, the one labeled RCP 6.0 for reasons I don't need to go into, which has us somewhere between 3 and 4, actually a little higher than that by the end of the century. Paris, we have international agreements to limit emissions related to global climate change. That's great. Nations of the world, I'm getting all mixed up in various technological complexities here. Nations of the world met in Paris in 2015, and they agreed to adopt a target for what we would attempt, note the word we, you're going to hear it a lot. Who's we? What we're going to attempt to limit global average heating to. In Paris, they adopted a target of 2 degrees, so the red line here is 2 degrees, not above that. In fact, in Paris, they strengthened it. They said well below 2 degrees C. And then at the initiative of a bunch of small, vulnerable, low-lying and island states, they added additional language that said try to stay as close as possible to 1.5. Gee, given that this is sort of a train barreling full speed ahead, it's kind of hard to imagine how we would turn this fast enough to stay below that, but that's what we agreed. We agreed on targets in Paris. Nations made a set of pledges about what they would do with their national emissions in order to contribute to meeting those targets. And in a very important step, for the first time, all the nations of the world accepted a parallel set of obligations. So climate policy previously had been hindered, troubled, and led to unnecessary conflict by an arbitrary binary distinction drawn in commitments. These countries, roughly the ones that were industrialized in 1990, do this, the rest do this lesser thing. So now everybody's under consistent obligations, but the obligations are very, very weak. They're essentially just procedural. So Paris was something. Paris was a real step forward. But it was a modest beginning step forward, one for which most of the hope of progress really lay in the framework it provided for subsequent actions that would be stronger, and the hope that there would be a kind of a reciprocal increase of ambition and effort among multiple nations. It's real progress, but small. And if you take a more hard-headed practical approach and ask, what are people actually doing to contribute to this, it looks really more troubling than that. And it's troubling in 4 different ways. It's like pile on, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news. Bad news 1, the national pledges that were made in Paris fall short of the targets. So the proposals that nations brought forward saying what they would limit their emissions to get us from a business as usual projection of about 4 or 4.5 degrees C by the end of the century to something like 3 to 3.5. That's a long way above 2. It's even further above 1.5. Second bad news, the actions that nations have actually undertaken fall short of the pledges. So, for example, the United States said something about how much it would reduce emissions, how fast. And then it attempted to promulgate a bunch of policies to pursue that. And the pledge wasn't strong enough, and the policies weren't strong enough to meet the pledge. So you're falling short in 2 ways. Bad news 3 is that there's growing evidence since Paris that the targets of 2 or 1.5 degrees aren't actually that safe or that protective. I mean, look around. We're at 1 degree now, and the system is far from having come to equilibrium. And things are getting really weird and disruptive already, aren't they? I mean, this week they're really weird. Last week they were really weird. As Ged said, there's tons of uncertainty. You can't confidently attribute any strange thing to the global trend. On the other hand, you couldn't confidently attribute any one of Barry Bonds' home runs to the steroids. But did that make you not think that the steroids were doing it? Maybe worst of all, I don't know if I have time to go into this. The worst piece of news in these projections is that the scenarios for future emissions and temperature that the Paris negotiators were looking at that gave them the comfort to believe that they could take a set of actions that would lead toward 2 or maybe 1.5 embedded enormous assumed reliance on the stuff that Ged referred to, future negative emissions. Enormous. Oh, sorry. Don't need to go that one. Here. Okay, this is a little visually complex. I'll see if I can lead you through it quickly. It's from a publication in Science last year. This is one group's analysis of a scenario to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. The black line here is emissions as we normally understand them. So around 40 billion tons now, dropping, wow, really fast, and then by the end of the century. That doesn't get you anywhere near staying to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. To get to those targets, in addition, they have this yellow and orange slice down here, which are engineered intentional removal of atmosphere. They did it with 2 ways, the same 2 ways that were considered in Paris. Build up a great deal more forest on presently unforested land, that's the orange one, and then grow hundreds of millions of hectares of energy crops, gather them, burn them for energy, and suck away the carbon when you burn them and stick that underground. That's called X, or bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. Look at how big this gets by the end of the century. 10 billion tons per year, 20 billion tons per year. That is an endeavor sucking carbon out of the atmosphere that is of the same. Current global emissions are about 40 billion tons per year. And there's a ton of evidence that the particular methods that they're projecting or assuming here would be really problematic if anybody tried to do them at anything like this scale. If you simply calculate the land use needs, the water use needs, the nutrient needs, basically an enterprise like this more or less displaces global food production. The areas involved in doing BECCS on this scale are something between the area of India and the area of Canada. things are looking pretty bad. In my opinion, which of course, I might be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, we are very likely on a trajectory where we're headed not to 1.5 or 2 degrees by the end of the century, but to 3, 3.5, or 4, even with much more aggressive attempts to cut emissions than we currently have now. Oh my goodness, let that settle in. 3, 3.5, or 4. Okay, now, here's the hard part of my job. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a call to action. But it's a call to action that is informed by a kind of clear-eyed view of reality, about the way the world works, about what's in the world right now, about what is possible for people collectively to do. So if we're talking about emissions cutting, which we absolutely must be doing, and we as fast and as much as possible, what we're fighting for is the margin between 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees, and 4 degrees. That is a margin that is absolutely worth fighting for. In fact, it's more worth fighting for the difference between 3 and 4 than it is for the difference between 2 and 3 or 1 and 2, because probably the further out you go, the worse things get in an increasingly rapid way. I'm not talking about there being any single margin of point of no return or a sudden cliff where everything goes to hell. Maybe there are such things, but nobody confidently knows that they exist or where they exist in advance. Far more likely situation is a hill of increasingly bad stuff the further up we go, where what we're fighting for is not to go up so high. Okay, what does this mean? Let me go briefly back to the sort of more regional level and talk about what it means for the kind of resource management and adaptation and resiliency issues that my co-panelists are mainly going to be talking about. First, it means effective adaptation to the climate change that's going to be coming, and that may be coming soon, is going to be a great deal more costly and difficult and politically contentious than current debate has assimilated or understood. There's something very strange about climate change policy debate when people talk about adaptation, which is there's this sort of universal assumption that, oh, adaptation is easy, we can kind of leave that, we'll figure it out. Now, mostly people talk like that when they're arguing against making serious efforts on mitigation, so I can understand why those people say that, but I don't really so much understand why people who also care about mitigation say that. Resource management. Adaptation to a continually changing climate means we lose anything that looks like planning or policy certainty over relevant investment time horizons. Because things are going to keep changing, all we can do, even if we do much better than we're doing presently, is take decisions that correspond to our best guess of how things are going to be over the time horizon that's relevant for the decision. But even that has no promises because it's both slow-moving and uncertain. We don't know. Adaptation means we have to build everything more robustly, as Ged alluded to. That means public infrastructure costs a great deal more. Oh, we'll just loosen up all the municipal and provincial budgets. How good a job do we do at that now? As far as I can tell, we can't even build adequately to manage distributions of current risks. Has anybody looked at those dikes in the lower Fraser Valley lately? And where they sit even relative to the distribution of current flood risks? One of my favorite examples, because I live in California now, is the East Bay approaches to the New Bay Bridge, finished 5 years ago. 4 years ago, it was discovered that they hadn't thought about climate change or variability, and that the East Bay approaches are already underwater at the highest tides, and they'll be consistently underwater in 30 years. Oh boy. Okay. What, sorry? Yeah. So adaptation means these things. Adaptation means orderly retreat from the most vulnerable areas. That means restrictions on private property, uncompensated takings. Oh, that's really easy. And worst of all, we have to do all this even as climate change continues. Ged said this, I want to highlight it. The most important misunderstanding people have about climate change and adaptation is that they tend to think that adaptation means taking one step to a new climate. A lot of people think that because they do projections that have an endpoint, like 2100. But what would it take to adjust to that? But it's still sloping up in 2100 unless or until we stop. If we don't do that, then you have to retreat again and again and again and again. Okay, what has to be done if we don't want to live in that world? Ged said it, we have to reduce human emissions to 0. Because as long as human net emissions are positive, there will continue to be anthropogenic climate change. That means a complete transformation of the world energy system and similarly huge changes to agriculture, land management, and a bunch of other stuff. How do we do that? I'm going to race really fast through. I know okay. So the way we do that, it's sort of the usual suspects. Same approaches as people have talking about, that fell flat, as people have been talking about for 20 or 30 years. In terms of energy, what do we have to do? First, increase efficiency of energy use so the complete demand is smaller. And then second, do the things that we know about. Replace the fossil economy, which is lucky because of all that great hydro in the electrical sector. BC is only 60%. A lot easy, right? So you want your solar, you want your wind, you want your hydroelectricity. I have to say that in BC. If you can do it right and sustainably, you want your biofuels. But climate-safe sources means sources that don't emit greenhouse gases. That also includes nuclear, and it also includes carbon capture and sequestration, which is kind of the sleeper. It's a piece of good news here. Carbon capture and sequestration, this is technologies to get the energy out of fossil fuels without emitting the CO2. Here we run into a huge political obstacle, a obstacle that is perhaps as serious as that the obstacle to effective action that comes from the people who don't want to solve climate change and pretend it's not a problem, is the people who want to solve it and somehow think it's so easy that you can pre-clear the agenda and only go to the energy sources or technologies that you like. You can't leave the ones you don't like off the table if they are also non-emitting sources. Nuclear probably is not an issue in BC because BC is lucky to have all this great hydroelectricity for firm power. Carbon capture may be an issue in BC. And in the rest of the world, you can't reject nuclear, you can't reject carbon capture. Here's another piece of bad news. The two worst things that are happening in the world right now are all the places where environmentalists are campaigning to prematurely close down nuclear power plants that are already working. California's doing it, Germany's doing it, everybody who does it has their emissions go up. Renewables are great, but you need more. Done.
Thomas, a UVA faculty fellow at the Center for Global Studies this year, an associate professor in the Department of Civil Engineering. Thomas, an hydrogeologist, interested in groundwater sustainability, regional to continental scale groundwater system, groundwater to surface water interactions, and fluid flow around geologic structures. He's known for integrating disciplines that are not often combined, such as field methods, numerical modeling, environmental chemistry, structural geology, GIS, and policy studies. And for Tom, with his expertise, we thought, to encourage you to think about, one of the most important aspects of dealing with climate change, which is building resilience and adaptation in ecological systems, in particular the global hydrological cycle. So if you could walk us through the current conditions of this global dimension of dealing with water management, the global hydrological cycle.
Thank you, Oliver. Can everyone hear me just fine at the back without this? Okay. So I am an engineer, but I'm not going to show you any graphs. I'm only going to show you pictures and try to tell you a couple stories. And the first story I want to talk about is, I'm not saying that I'm this good looking when I brush my teeth, but what I think about when I brush my teeth sometimes. So the first question I think about is, should I turn off the tap? I'm going to try to provide a little bit of an answer for how I think about this throughout this talk. The second thing I ask is how much water should we use globally? I'm kind of thinking about that all the time. And then the last thing I'm often thinking about is how much water do these salmon need? I'm going to bring these three questions together throughout this talk, because I think how much water the salmon need, so how much water should be in our rivers to make sure they have enough water for these salmon, is related to the first two questions. How much water can we use, and if I should turn off this tap. So what you can't, if you kind of really focus your eyes on the salmon, what you see is there's a really nice gravel bed, and there's large amounts of water coming down this river, and both of these things are essential for these salmon to live. Last year, I had the opportunity to go to a very different place than British Columbia, Kansas. And so this is a photo of the Arkansas River. So because in Kansas, they call Arkansas Arkansas because they want to emphasize the Kansas in the Arkansas. So this is the Arkansas River down in Kansas. And this river used to flow. It used to flow all the time. And this photo was taken in the middle of the riverbed with a dam in the background. And so what happened in the Arkansas River in Kansas? Well, what happened was about 50 years ago, we started pumping groundwater, pumping a lot of groundwater. And so this map here, and these maps on the right, have really, to be honest, motivated my research the last 5 or so years, because they really blew me away. So if you look at the top map is the distribution of rivers. The map of those same rivers, the same state, 1994, and you can see very clearly a whole bunch of rivers have disappeared. One of them was this Arkansas River here, and lots of others disappeared here. The photo in the middle of these maps is the Arkansas River. Well, what happened was a lot of groundwater pumping happened. When you pump groundwater, the water table in the wells drops. That lowers the water that's available in the rivers, and rivers dry up, or they don't flow during dry seasons. And why we were pumping so much water there was a quite simple answer: wheat. Farming that goes on in Kansas. Much of it is for wheat and grains. I'm simplifying it slightly, but if you on a very coarse level, what was drying up those rivers was beef production. And so when we eat beef, little tag here that says 2,400 liters. That's how much water is in your average hamburger. Obviously, that water isn't in the hamburger. The water isn't. You're not diluted by, you're not under a deluge of water when you're drinking hamburger. What this is called is virtual water. It's the water that's embedded in products that we eat or consume. So 2,400 liters of water comes along with that hamburger. And then that's causing these rivers to dry out, unlike the nice salmon. That was one river going through a region in Kansas. Now, like globally, that's what I was tasked with. Well, this is a map, and again, you're going to be able to see the details of the numbers at the bottom of the map. What I want you to really focus on are the oranges and reds and bright yellows. Those are the regions of the world that have water stress. What water stress is areas where people are using too much water. And it turns out that 1/3 of the global population lives in areas with water stress. That's a real big problem. And you can see that those areas are in a number of different places around the world. All the way throughout Western North America, Europe, the Middle East, throughout large parts of Asia, and also South Africa. Yeah, sure. And so we see globally that we have this significant water stress. And if we want more bad news, if you guys were kind of in the mood for more bad news, why not? So it's now currently about 1/3, but predictions are that by the end of the century, a half of the world's population are going to live in these areas of water stress. So That's the picture kind of globally distributed. We've been talking about quite a bit about climate change. And a new kind of idea that came out in the sciences recently was an idea called the planetary boundaries. It's a nice idea. And the idea is that the Earth has a number of different systems. One system is the climate system. Another system is the nitrogen system. Another system is the water system. And these global scientists came up with this concept that there are limits to how much we can use of these resources and how much we can change the Earth and still keep the Earth in our habitable pre-Anthropocene state. So keep it in our cozy bubble that we like to live in and that keeps us able to live. And so today what we're actually talking about are two planetary boundaries. We're talking about the first planetary boundary that we've been talking about is climate change. And the climate change planetary boundary, and this diagram here shows you kind of as you can think of this as a dashboard for the Earth. So if the Earth is happy in all these 9 different systems, that would all be green. And as we go further out, that we're going past these planetary boundaries for the different systems, and the Earth is getting less happy. And so climate change, we're at or beyond the boundary. I've blacked these out because I didn't want you to focus on them, but for biosphere integrity, so for genetic loss, for example, we're past the boundary, as well as for nitrogen. But for freshwater, the story actually in this analysis, which I think is flawed, but we won't get into the details right now, suggests that we're actually good for water. What these scientists said is that we can use about 4,000 cubic kilometers per year and kind of keep the Earth within this happy state. That's the planetary boundary for water. So that's suggesting that we're within the planetary boundary for water. But what does that mean locally? We all live here in Victoria largely, and this is a photo of the Cowichan River. So an interesting and important question is, if we pump water from the Cowichan River, will that water use actually impact other places of the world? The answer to that question is really what you do with that water. So if you're irrigating that water, it can change. The thing I didn't tell you about Kansas is that when people started pumping groundwater in Kansas, they actually sent so much water up into the air through evaporation that it actually changed the climate in the middle of the United States. So you can actually change climate patterns by water use. So there are these links between climate and water systems that are really important. The second way that it's very important to think about these global problems is that they're globally distributed. So we have a couple things going on. We have water stress and water use can change climate systems. We have this globally distributed problem. And then we have this third thing. We have this virtual water, which is a global phenomenon. So we trade many things. We trade hamburgers, we trade textiles, we trade lots of things. And with all those things comes this virtual water. So this is a global map of the trade of virtual water. So we have some countries actually bring in more virtual water, and so they're called virtual water importers. Those are mostly the wealthy countries of the world, and there's virtual water exporters, and those are generally the poorer countries. So this is a map showing you how that virtual water comes into Europe, just as an example, and where it's coming from. You can make maps for anywhere in the world. And so a way of thinking about this is using that hamburger. So how and where did that hamburger come from? So you can think effectively of that hamburger moving from, say, Argentina, coming to Europe, and with that 2,000 liters of water, this is just one hamburger, remembering, and all that comes with it. So together we have a global water system that shows that there is stress. We have this global virtual water system, which is moving water around in products. And we have water impacting climate systems regionally. So what I think, and when I add this all together, I think this is kind of a call to think of our blue marbles. This is the original image that I think is just so powerful that came out of the first NASA missions, that we all live on this blue planet. And we often think of water as a local problem and a local consideration. I think Rosie, the next speaker, will continue along this theme, and I think it's super important. And I think we can think of those water as a local problem and as a local resource within this broader global context. And I think we can think across scales. So when we think about water planning, we can often think at a watershed scale, and we can try to imagine how those watershed scale impacts and decisions take us back to our global scale problems and impacts. And we can take that all the way to much smaller scales, into individual neighborhoods or individual homes or development sites. So I'll just leave you with two more things. If we want to think globally and drink locally, this is one way to say this, I'll give you two ways that you can act or drink locally and potentially have a big global impact. The two ways are to plan and be part of watershed planning. This is a CRD or very many other groups that respects local, regional, and site water balances and water budgets. And eat what I don't know if other people have actually, I didn't Google this, I don't know if I came up with this or not, a low water diet. So this is a photo of the meat department at Thrifty's being restocked. So you can think about the virtual water in your steak or your hamburger the next time you're at Thrifty's or wherever else you shop. And the question I wanted to leave you with is which river story would you like to tell your grandchildren? The story of the salmon swimming happily upstream in a nice braided river, or the dry Arkansas River. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. You perfectly set the agenda for Rosie Sims, our next speaker, whom we asked to look into how the global challenge and uncertainty regarding the governance and management of water translates into local practices and local responses. Let me briefly introduce Rosie Sims to you, who is a water law and policy researcher and coordinator for the Panelists project, Water Sustainability, here at UVic. In 2015, Rosie completed her MA at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC, where her research explored histories and interactions between First Nations water governments in British Columbia. So, Rosie, the floor is yours. It would be great if you could come also up here.
Very well hydrated on my 18 liters here. Right. So I think the previous three speakers have made it very clear that we're facing some major global planetary changes, climate change barreling on at truly terrifying speeds, and with it, a hydrological cycle going somewhat haywire. And we've also heard that these global scale changes have very profoundly local consequences, and this is particularly the case with water. And so what then is the role of local institutions in responding in the face of these global challenges? And how do we decide in these very uncertain times how water is used, who gets to access it or not, how we leave enough flowing in our system so that the salmon that Tom showed can actually survive and thrive, and importantly, who gets to make those decisions? And so these are some of the critical governance questions that we are asking at the Panelists Water Sustainability Project. And they're also questions that I started asking as I was growing up in the West Kootenays outside of Nelson and seeing some very strange landscapes all around me, like this one. And so this is the shoreline of Duncan Lake, or as I later came to realize, Duncan Reservoir. And I definitely had no idea at the time who was in charge of the decisions that were so deeply affecting this watershed. And it's definitely not surprising. I did not understand, because it turns out that the Columbia watershed, within which the Kootenays fall, is really a famous North American example known for its governance complexity. It's a heavily regulated hydrological system under the terms of the Columbia River Treaty signed in the 60s between Canada and the States to deal with power and flood control. And there's 14 major dams downstate on the main stem of the Columbia River alone. So really, this is just one watershed, and I think one thing that the Columbia River case shows is that water governance and making decisions about this resource is inherently complicated. And this is in large part because water cares very little, not at all, about the lines and the borders that we've drawn on maps to delineate responsibilities and power for decision-making. So in Canada, we have at least 4 orders of government that have responsibilities and authority for water. We have the federal government, the provinces, regional and local districts, regional districts and local governments, and then of course Indigenous authority, which has been present on the landscape for thousands of years longer than any of the others. And what's really important is that there's very unclear divisions of power between these different levels of government, and water can easily slip through the cracks. And so this is part of the reason why we think collaboration and partnerships are an absolutely important part of how we go forward. No one government has all of the resources, authority, or knowledge to do this alone. And it turns out that really we don't have a lot of faith in the system we have right now. This is from a survey we did in 2015 with about 500 respondents in BC representing all levels of government, industry, NGOs, etc. And 74% said they think BC's water is currently managed poorly or very poorly. So this is really not a great vote of confidence in our status quo. And so really all this is to say is that our status quo approaches to water governance and decision-making in BC really don't provide the optimal tools for the increasing challenges we're facing. And there's definitely not one single pathway forward or an easy answer here, which I think the other speakers have made clear. But one area we think that offers a lot of potential is watershed governance. And fundamentally, this involves moving away from our siloed, very top-down approaches where communities have little say in the decisions in their watersheds to something that is nested within ecological as opposed to political boundaries and is much more collaborative in nature. And so there's lots of different things required to make the shift towards watershed governance happen. We've done any number of policy analyses on this, but in a nutshell, what we need is a mix of winning conditions. Lots of things need to happen from provincial and national governments, like functioning legal frameworks that actually give us a good set of rules for fresh water. We need robust water science and monitoring strategies, in part funded through our senior governments. But a lot of things are also needed at the local level. We need local water champions within our local governments and for citizens to step up for their watersheds. And we also need regional sustainable funding strategies to support this work. And so of all the winning conditions, today I really want to focus in on one, and that is the condition of co-governance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments. And in very generic terms, co-governance refers to when 2 or more self-governing jurisdictions agree to share authority to make and enforce decisions. In this case, for water, could be for anything. And we've seen a lot of interest and momentum growing for co-governance approaches, and it's particularly important today in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with UNDRIP, and I really don't have time to give much of the backstory today. But as you know, it is an international instrument, and it sets out collective and individual rights for Indigenous peoples. It's not legally binding domestically in Canada, at least not yet. It has not been incorporated to our laws. But both Canada and BC have made it very clear that they are committed to implementing the declaration, and they're going to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation, at least guided in part by the UNDRIP and its principles. The declaration is very wide-ranging, and it's meant to be read as a whole, not kind of picked apart. But I am picking it apart here just to highlight one provision in particular, because it sets the stage for a very different approach to decision-making for land and water. And that is that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands, territories, or other resources. So of course, this is a very different way of doing business than what we currently have in BC and Canada. And there's a very complex and ongoing and contested discussion about what UNDRIP means and how it can actually be brought to life in Canada. Can we do that without it being part of our laws? And there's a lot of outstanding questions too about how co-governance for water can actually be realized when we have governments with very different laws, contested authorities, and different ways of going about things. And so we really wanted to unpack some of these questions and do so in the BC freshwater context particularly. And so to do so, we partnered last year with the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources. They're a national First Nation-directed organization. And our colleagues and co-authors there, Marilyn Fair and Michael Miltenberger, for several years now have been working to develop and articulate this concept called collaborative consent. So Michael was the Minister of Environment in the Northwest Territories for a number of years, and Marilyn Fair was the lead negotiator for the NWT on several transboundary water agreements. And together they were seeing something very different unfolding in the territory in terms of how the territorial and Aboriginal governments were working together. So this included territorial and Indigenous governments sitting down together for 3 years to actually co-draft legislation together for species at risk. And it included coming to a joint negotiating position throughout the process of developing these transboundary water agreements. And so we wanted to kind of lift the ideas that Marilyn and Michael had developed in the NWT context, develop and explain them further, and then see how we might apply them in the BC context, particularly for fresh water. So we have a whole report on this, and I really don't have time. I'm going to stay very high level today. And also just to emphasize that we intend this to be a living document, a living research approach, so we're continuing to refine and learn as we engage in dialogue. So we expect this to continue to evolve over the coming years. So collaborative consent, what is this thing that we are calling collaborative consent? In a nutshell, this is a mutual consent process, mutual consent being the core of this definition, through which Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments commit to working together from the very outset with the goal of achieving each other's consent on decisions, policies, laws, and plans, or whatever the matter at hand is. So it's about both governments exerting their authority, coming to the table on matters of common concern, treating each other honorably and with mutual respect as governing partners. And so we talk about collaborative consent as an outlook. It's this outlook to come to the table with a deep commitment to receive consent and to not proceed over the disagreement of your partner. It's a process. It's a long-term process of engagement that starts at the very outset, all the way through to negotiation and implementation. This is never over. It's about an ongoing governance relationship. And we also talk about collaborative consent as an outcome of co-governance. Two governments are arguably not truly co-governing unless they're actually getting each other's consent on the important decisions along the way. And just one other thing I wanted to flag here is that this does not mean that all decisions all of a sudden have to be made in a joint way. Everybody's involved in each other's business all the time. But instead, Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments are deciding where they need to collaborate, where they don't, and how that's going to go forward. And so really we're talking about a very fundamental transformative governance change here. It's not easy, and it's about Crown and Indigenous governments adapting, building new shared spaces, and coming together to see if this is a pathway forward they wish to pursue or not, and for what watershed issues. We do see collaborative consent already in motion across Canada. Certainly the NWT, as I mentioned, has been a leader in this regard. And it turns out also there's a really great example unfolding in our own backyards here. And so I want to pay another quick visit to the Cowichan watershed, which I know Tom has already introduced, because there's some really interesting stuff happening there. I think it's a fascinating microcosm of some of the issues the previous speakers have referenced. It also demonstrates some of the important responses and possibilities of watershed governance. So the Cowichan in recent years has been experiencing a lot of different issues related to land and water, but in particular, it's seeing these very extreme swings from too much water on the landscape one season to not enough in the next, and then back again. And this is something that really has stuck with me. On the left-hand side here, during a flood event, you can see a fish actually using a flooded roadway to move upstream, which I think is quite opportunistic, but it's making its way upriver. And then on the right-hand side, this is during a drought event, and volunteers actually had to truck the salmon upstream because the river was totally disconnected from the estuary up to the spawning grounds. And so, unsurprisingly, in one of these drought crises back in 2003, there was a lot of conflict and acrimony. The Chinook salmon were being trucked upstream. Catalyst Mill, which is the largest employer in the area, almost had to shut down. And there was a lot of tension and a lot of acrimony. But eventually, out of this conflict situation, there was a plan created for the watershed that sets out some clear targets. And a plan, of course, is great, but it doesn't really go anywhere unless there's someone to implement it. And so in 2010, a very unique collaborative partnership emerged in the form of the Cowichan Watershed Board. And there's a lot of things that make the Cowichan Board unique. But I think for me, what's most interesting is that at the helm and steering the board as the co-chairs are both the Cowichan tribes and the regional district. So right now you have the chief of Cowichan tribes and the mayor of North Cowichan sitting together and driving the Cowichan Watershed Board forward. And so in the past 8 years, they've really been able to build a very strong foundation of partnerships. They've set out some clear targets for what they want to achieve together, like having water quality cleaned up so that you can actually harvest the shellfish from the estuary again by 2020. So they've accomplished a lot, and there's a real sense of mutual responsibility both to each other, but also to the health of the watershed going forward. And right now they're engaged in a really interesting process of figuring out how they can do more, if they can take on more authority, actually make decisions, and do this in a way that respects the needs and the rights and the responsibilities of the partners. And so I won't go into too much detail, but they really are digging into some of the hard questions of the day, like, can Cowichan tribes' Indigenous laws and principles and authority be better reflected in the work of the board? And is it possible to get the local tax base to agree to paying more per year to be able to fund an entity like this? There's champions in the board itself. Will people pay $15 more a year to support an initiative like this going forward? And so there's lots, as you can see, happening in the Cowichan. I think it's a fascinating example of water governance and innovation. It's certainly not the only example. We're seeing a lot of these initiatives sort of popping up across BC and across the country. And again, this is from that survey I referenced at the beginning, but I think we're really seeing a strong appetite for this kind of locally based approach. And so 85%, again, of those respondents agreed that we need local entities like the Cowichan Watershed Board to implement BC's new water law and advance water sustainability in the province. And so I have just 3 final points to make before I wrap up. The first is that we really think water is a useful vehicle for collaboration. It's a kind of an entry point because, again, it transcends boundaries and jurisdictions. And at least in Canada, it's still very much valued as a public resource and a common good. And so we really think it's an interesting venue to pursue more collaborative and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations. And I also want to highlight the importance of proactive local leadership, even in the face of these very daunting global challenges. We certainly need our senior governments to take action, but I think there's a lot that can happen at the local levels in the meantime, and folks shouldn't wait around for the perfect silver bullet solution to come from somewhere else. I think there's a lot communities can do to start advancing their own vision for the watershed. And the final point, and I know the Polis lead, Oliver Brandeis, has been making this for 10 years already, so we might need to rethink it, but that we think governance needs to change more in the next 10 years than it has in the past 100 to really equip us to deal with the challenges at hand. And so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosie. With our last speaker, we again change gears and go to a different perspective on the underlying foundational narratives, cultural understandings of our responses to climate change. And the last speaker, I introduced Anita Girvan, who is currently at UVate with a limited term position in the School of Environmental Studies, where she teaches political ecology, and her research, and that gives you a sense of what you're going to hear soon, relates to cultural politics of climate change, ecological metaphors, climate justice, water stories in politics, post-colonialism, political ecology, and environmental humanities. And with her latest project, entitled Trickster Carbon, she explores trickster stories from her Caribbean cultural moorings as an alternative to colonial understanding of carbon, which attempts to trap, sequester, and manage an inherently unruly and ambivalent carbon. So, Anita, the floor is yours.
Rosie, you forgot your water over here. Are you sufficiently rehydrated? Thank you all for coming. I hope you don't think you arrived at the climate change bunker of doom. Doesn't it feel like you came from the sunshine and entered a bunker today? So I'd like to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to the multi-millennial caretakers of these lands, the Lekwungen and Husainich people. I'm inspired by the work and community building that Rosie spoke about within the Cowichan watershed, and also by increasing efforts to engage multiple voices and ways of knowing that have often been silenced in large part due to processes of colonization. What I would like to suggest is that the story, or stories, as I shall insist, of climate change are not incidental to the story or stories of colonization. Climate change gives us a unique, if urgent, opportunity, yes, I use that word in the bunker of doom, opportunity, to look at dominant stories that we have inherited from globally dominant systems. Even as we are hopefully inspired to transform dominant fossil fuel infrastructures, as my fellow panelists have said, which are seemingly techno-scientific fixes, so can we look to the transformative power of stories and efforts to help shape livable and just futures. Get my mug off of there. There we go. As we evoke the crisis in Cape Town, South Africa, by our water jug here, as a way of moving all of us here to think about our relationship with water, I am reminded by Sune Payne, a reporter who lives in the townships outside of Cape Town, that she and those in her household of 9 have been living voluntarily on less than 350 liters a day for many years. In a recent article, The Atlantic quotes an activist who suggests that these water rations have been going on for a long time, and, quote, there used to be a name for it, apartheid. So by understanding different perspectives and stories on climate change as a global and local phenomenon that is felt differently by different people, even within the same bioregion, I think we need to engage complex stories that intersect with climate change. So here again, I'm suggesting that this isn't a doom and gloom scenario, but that especially you can see the movement within Canada recently to deal with things like colonization as a hopeful time. I'm really thinking this part in history is a time when we can look at these intersecting crises together and maybe move towards some hopeful solutions. But let me back up a bit and define what I mean by stories here. So I don't mean this. Did you read it for a second? Then there was a change of government and climate change just went away, hooray! So we've got the fairy tales story over here. So that might be called fake news, right? So as someone who works with stories, metaphors, and language, but engages with interdisciplinary understandings of climate change, including science, I must first qualify my use of story. I do not mean that climate change is just a story in the untrue sense. There is concerning and consequential dismissal of climate science by some leaders today, and a gutting of programs that feature science in public interest. And by publics, I mean both human and non-human. But I also suggest that there is sometimes a misplaced idea that more climate science, more data, facts will be the force that moves all people and shifts political institutions and infrastructures in the direction we need to go. When we think of what moves us, and Ted rightly asked who are we, who is us, as a kind of a diverse group, we have to think about what moves us individually and in groups and in the various kinds of constituencies in which we exist. So I propose that stories, with their capacity to connect us with meaning for our lives and others, are kinds of technology that we all might have at our disposal. So I'm calling here stories sense-making technologies that make worlds, and I'm looking at Robin Wall Kimmerer's. Some of you might have seen her speak about a month ago here. She talks about stories as a compass, so kind of a technology. They provide a map. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, an ethnobotanist who blends Western science with Potawatomi storied knowledge and the teaching of plants themselves, suggests that stories are like a compass. They provide an orientation. So you'll notice that centering stories doesn't mean that these are always perfect, right? That stories are always equally good for all purposes. For example, if you want to generate a gold medal race for an Olympic athlete, you're going to mobilize a different story than if you want to generate generosity in communities of care for a child in a kindergarten class. So by suggesting that stories are technologies for sense-making, I'm evoking a kind of ambivalence about technologies, which some of my fellow panelists have already talked about. Some of these are ambivalent. We have to sort of grapple with some unsettling realities. But I'm also suggesting that we develop critical skills in evaluating stories that might help with certain aspects of climate change. And these might look different in different places. Further, I also insist that science is itself a storied proposition that mobilizes values of the day as much as objective truths. So if we look at the science of eugenics, for instance, a science founded a couple of centuries ago by British natural scientist and explorer Francis Galton, we can see the influence of values at work. Eugenics, of course, mobilized what we now understand as the story of race to enable, quote, the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. So this application of a seemingly objective science led to the forced sterilization of many racialized groups and those who were deemed mentally ill, not to mention how this science was applied in Nazi Germany, right? This case is definitely a hyperbolic case, and I'm not suggesting that there's an equivalence here between the climate science that we need to recognize the very important things that we've talked about so far. But nonetheless, it illustrates that certain problems and solutions that have been constructed through science have stories behind them that bear mentioning, bear sort of explicit attention. So the question is, what stories shape some of our scientifically constructed problems and solutions today, and how are they fitting? I don't mean, again, to make an equivalence between eugenics. That was just a kind of a straw person argument to show a case. But let's look at the very... Oh, sorry. I'm going to go ahead a little bit to this one that we've looked at least 3 times, right? How many people have seen this before today multiple times, right? Okay, so I want to look at this model briefly, and it's presented as we see here in many publics as a motivator to do something about climate change. First, I would like to acknowledge in this graph the key aspects that my colleagues have highlighted. So even the best case scenarios for warming based on emissions that are already out there put us over the 2-degree global warming here. And I would also like to ask, who is moved by such a graph to do something? Can I ask by show of hands? Some of you, maybe, you can be honest. Right? But I'm thinking that some of you are not, right? Is that clear? Who might not be moved so much by this narrative? By show of hands. Thank you. So just, again, I'm not saying that this graph is bad or good, but that different constituents might respond to it differently. And there's a lot of work around fear as a motivator that is not working right now, so we can think about what kinds of things are working. So I want to think then, what would it take to move those of us who didn't put up their hands? So another issue is if climate scientists tell us, as we've heard already today, that we can't feel climate change because climate is weather made statistical over decades, right? Then what can we do to feel it and make a move? Paradoxically, climate change has to be storied at the local and felt level, even as it remains a global phenomenon that is abstracted in the atmosphere. And it needs to connect us to entities we're attached to. So I want to suggest here that just as we understand from the biodiversity perspective that we need multiple species of plants and animals and all of those good things to be in a healthy kind of environment, we also need cultural diversity of stories that help us shape this. Maybe some of you know the Saanich story of emergence. It is one I've been thinking about a lot in the past couple of years. I've lived here for almost 12 years now, but I just came to know it in the last couple of years. So it's with some hesitation and humility that I read part of it today because I'm not of the Usenet nations. Nonetheless, the story is shared publicly in a number of places, including in a piece by Philip Kevin Paul and another article by Jack Horn, as well as on the Usenet website. So this story has been deemed appropriate and necessary to share by those who guard it. I would say that as a story of rising waters in these regions is one that might be instructive. So here's the story. Once, long ago, the ocean's power was shown to an unsuspecting people. The tides began rising higher and higher than even the oldest people could remember. It became clear to these people that there was something very dangerous about this tide. The seawaters continued to rise for several days. Eventually, the people needed their canoes. They tied all of their rope together, made of cedar bark, and then to themselves. One end of the rope was tied to an arbutus tree on top of the mountain, and when the water stopped rising, the people were left floating in their canoes above the mountain. It was the raven who appeared to tell them that the flood would soon be over. When the flood waters were going down, a small child noticed the raven circling in. The child began to jump around and cry in excitement, "Look what is emerging!" And in that emerging word is Usenet. I have not the capacity to speak Sinchothan well enough to reproduce the whole phrase, but I'm hoping to learn. Below where the raven had been circling, a piece of land had begun to emerge. The old man pointed down to a place and said, "That is our new home, Usenet. And from now on, we will be known as the Usenet, or emerging people." The old man also declared on that day that the mountain which had offered them protection would be treated with great care and respect, the same respect given to their greatest elders, and it was to be known as the place of refuge. Also, the arbutus trees would no longer be used for firewood. So I'd like to suggest that story is one that may resonate with local places and knowledge keepers. So it's instructive because it is a story of those local impacts of climate change. And it also shows continuity and rupture. So I think often Indigenous stories are put into sort of a phase of understanding fixity and romantic nostalgia to the past, and the colonial interpretations tend to sort of say that that's done, that's old news, it doesn't relate to what we have today, to changing. But what I like about this story is that it was apparently continuous with the time of the Noah's Ark flood story. And it gave some new changes, some shifts in the story to approaches that would shift, including, the arbutus tree would never be cut for firewood. So there are some profoundly important orienting principles. So when we think about that notion of the story as an orientation or compass, this one gives us a good clue. So here we've got some of the local things that might be dear to your heart. So that, for me, is a way also of connecting with things that matter instead of abstracting. And that's not to say that stories can't also be abstract to some degree, but I think by show of hands, some of you did respond to the abstraction of the graph, and others might respond differently to stories. So I want to just read a couple of quotes around stories and think about them as technologies. So this is from Arthur Frank's Letting Stories Breathe. Stories work with people, for people, and always stories work on people, affecting what people are able to see as real, as possible, and as worth doing or best avoided. And further, human, and I'm adding here non-human with an exclamation mark, life depends on the stories we tell, the sense of self those stories impart, the relationships constructed around shared stories, and the sense of purpose that stories both propose and foreclose. So I'll just go back to the slide. I think this makes more sense now to look at these kinds of ways I think we can evaluate stories. So I think some of the things we can ask of climate change today are, What are the narrative frames and foundational stories? Thank you. Who makes them and who is moved by them? And again, I would say the we here is plural and the stories are diverse. Are solutions emerging from the cultural stories and ways of knowing that have, in part, contributed to the problem? So this one's key in terms of colonization. I think one that we can all learn from. I think of the stories that I grew up with through school about what knowledge counted, and it did tend to be of a kind of a monocultural type. I feel like there were a lot of stories missing from my own education here in British Columbia. So I want to think about not just for the principles of Indigenous rights, which may motivate some of you to think about, but others might be motivated by thinking also about what kinds of knowledge might shape different solutions that might shift some of the stories that I think many of us are coming to know are a bit faulty at this point, right, in this Anthropocene. I want to ask the question, who or what remains invisible? We can think of Cape Town, for example. I think the transatlantic slave journey is also part of that story, and when we think of what knowledges were lost. And number 5, how open are these stories to inevitable shifts? So I want to end on good news, and I think the good news here is that stories of continuity and change among humans and non-humans exist, as the one that I read to you demonstrates, especially within cultures that have been colonized but continue to resist. So I think this makes us all more sensitive to cultural stories that can help many people. So it's not just about Indigenous rights, although that is important too, but about different ways of looking at climate change and the knowledges that come from different communities. And I think, in a sense, we're all experts since we emerged from wombs. We've all been dealing with stories, right? So this is how we make sense, profound sense of the ways we're around it. So what I'm just proposing is that we need to become attuned to these stories that we're looking around and how they can solve the many different issues of climate change as a global and local issue. Thank you very much.
I think that also, looking at the watch, that's a very good note to end. And I hope that from what you heard from the panel, when we think about what Ted described as the collective agency that might move our responses to this fundamental challenge that we face, that the university with its expertise working with and in communities might be at least part of the solution. So I thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I thank our panel very much for very stimulating talks.